Hello, I'm Matt from Practical BI and welcome to part 3 in this Power BI Basics tutorial series. As with both the previous parts, this series is aimed at absolute beginners and there are no prerequisites for understanding and following along with the content of this tutorial. So in this tutorial I'm covering the filters pane and slicers, which both do a very similar job, but we'll have a look in detail at what they can do, and they are definitely some of the elements that make Power BI a very powerful tool. Okay, so let's dive straight into our report.
Okay, so I'm in my report as we left it last time. I've got a few visuals on here, but probably could do with a bit of tidying up, but we'll look at that in future tutorials. So let's start with the filters pane here. So the filters pane allows us to add filters at 3 different levels of the report, and it allows us to provide these filters to users in a handy collapsible pane. So much as you can in the desktop version, when I click on the collapse arrow here, the filters pane disappears. The same thing happens within Power BI Service online for your users consuming the dashboard that way as well. So really handy that you can hide that. And in the past, I think people have gone to a lot of effort, developers have gone to a lot of effort to create custom collapsible or appearing and reappearing, disappearing and reappearing filters panes. But to an extent, that's eliminated by that's almost completely eliminated, I should say, by the ability to use the filters pane that Power BI has built in. So as I mentioned, there are 3 levels on this filters pane. Let's select one of my visuals here. I'm just going to select the bar chart. And you can see that I can now see these 3 levels. So the first one is filters on this visual. The second is filters on this page. And the third is filters on all pages. So the clues are in the title really, but let's start from the bottom here. So filters on all pages. If I apply a filter at this stage, then that filter will apply to all pages in the dashboard, no matter which page I'm on when I apply that filter. So let's have a look at that in action. So I'm just going to add a new page to demonstrate, and let's copy across one of my visuals from this page into my new page. And let's maybe add something new as well. Just bring in a table here, and I'll just add in country and country info. And let's maybe add in maybe that's fine for now. Okay, so I'm just going to drag in country to my filters on all pages. So I've just dragged that from my fields list over to where it says add data fields here. I'm going to drop that. You can see that straight away it pops up with a filter on country. I can see countries at the top. It tells me that currently I'm looking at all countries, and it tells me that my filter type is basic filtering. We'll go into the different filter types in a second, but first of all, let's just see what happens when I just select a single country. Let's just start by just selecting Canada here. Okay, so you can see that on the page that I'm on, this has filtered the data. I can just see Canada in my country table here, and you may have noticed that the data changed in my products table as well, just to show the units sold by product for Canada. Now, if I click on my product sales page, I can see that once again, I'm only showing data for Canada, and the numbers below, although you might not remember, but these have updated as well. So my filters have applied across all pages of my dashboard. Okay, so a couple of ways I can remove that filter. I can click on the eraser icon here to clear the filter, or I can just select the box that I've selected again to clear it. Works in a similar way again to Excel if you're familiar with filters there. So let's just erase that. And before I look at the other areas that we can add a filter, let's just have a look at a few of the other options that we've got here. So first of all, I've got the X here to remove the filter. I'll leave it on for now though. I've got a padlock icon to lock the filter, and what this means is if I apply the lock at this stage, then when I publish my dashboard to the Power BI service online, the users of the dashboard won't be able to unlock that filter then. So I can force a filter to remain in a certain state. So I could force, for example, just Canada to be filtered within the dashboard, and users wouldn't be able to change that. And then below I've got the eye icon here, which allows me to show and hide my filter. So I could, for example, apply a filter, lock it and hide it, and then when I publish my dashboard online, the users of the dashboard won't be able to see that there's a filter there. And the final option I'm going to look at just before we dive into the filter types is this require single selection option at the bottom. So currently I could select Canada and France, for example, and you can see that the data updates accordingly. But if I click require single selection, you see that first of all it's cleared them in the first instance. But if I select Canada and then select France, see I am only allowed one selection at any point in time, so it's deselected Canada for me at the point that I select France, and I can continue to do that, and it will only allow me to select one country at a time. I'll take that off for now. So let's just have a look at these these filter types. So currently I'm under basic filtering, and that's this selection approach where I can see my the possible values within my data set, the number of records I have against each value, and I can select them accordingly. If I drop down on here, I've also got an option with country selected of advanced filtering. So let's just have a look at that. So this allows me to specify conditions in a bit more depth. So I can say only show items when the value contains, let's say I could say only countries that contain an A, for example. And I can click apply filter to that. And you can see that that's removed Mexico because Mexico doesn't contain an A. Equally, I could drop down on contains here, and I can modify the options that I have. I can look at starts with, is exactly. I can look at where it's blank or not blank, and so on. And I can add multiple criteria. So I could say only show me a country that starts with C and ends with does not start with, or maybe let's say does not contain an F, and apply the filters there. And you can see that I only Canada meets that criteria within my country options. So let's clear that. And just before we move on to the other sections, let's have a look at what happens when I bring a numeric value into my filters here. So let's take units sold, and I'll drag that into my add data fields below. I'm just going to click the arrow at the top here to collapse that first filter. And so what you'll notice is previously when we brought in country, that was a text field. We'll look at data types in a later tutorial, but just for now, notice that when I bring in a field that's numeric, so units sold, the default is to this advanced filtering option, and I can still drop down and go to basic filtering, but crucially, when I go to my options under advanced filtering, I have different options I can look at, is less than, is greater than or equal to, etc., as opposed to contains or starts with. So that's all relative to the data type of the field that I bring in. So let's remove that. So that's filters on all pages. Now, if I look at filters on this page, as you probably guessed, that will only apply filters to the page that I'm on. So let's just add a product filter onto this page. Now, if I select VTT here, you can see that my data is all updated to VTT on this page. But when I go to my page 1, you see I can still see all of the products here, and that filter doesn't appear on the filters pane or apply to the page. So let's go back and have a look at that filter again. So filters, no matter where they sit on the filters pane, will work in the same way. I have my options to look at basic filtering, advanced filtering, and I'll just remove that one there as well. Okay, now let's select. I'm going to select my bar chart at the bottom here. Now what you notice now is for the extra section that's appeared on my filters pane, the filters on this visual, I've actually got 4 filters pre-populated. And these relate to the 4 fields that I have as part of my bar chart already. So I've got my product on my axis. My x-axis is there. I've got my units sold, and I'm using sale price and the first country info value as my tooltips. So I've got them appearing as well. So I can expand any of these, and I could apply a filter just to this visual to say, in this visual, I only want to show VTT and Montana. And you can see that that's applied in this visual, but isn't affecting any of the rest of the visuals on the page. Now, when I deselect these, I can drop down on product here. You'll notice that I've got an additional option to advanced filtering and basic filtering for my filter types. I can go to top N. Now let's select top N. Now this allows me to take, let's say, a top 5 or a top 10 products or whatever the field may be, based on a particular calculation or value. So let's say I only wanted to show my top 5 products rather than the 6 that are here. So I can put in top 5 and I can drag in a value field that's going to determine whether they fall in that top 5 or not. So let's just drag in units sold here. I'm just going to drop down and make sure that my aggregation here is a sum. So I've got top 5 by value units sold, and I'm just going to click apply filter there. You'll notice that now I'm only showing 5 products. And if I select a particular country, let's say France, for example, then we see that 5 products is dynamic. So I'm showing the top 5 sales. In this instance, I can see Montana applied. If I select France, Montana no longer appears in the top 5, and so isn't showing on the visual there. So Montana doesn't appear in the top 5 for France, I should say. So it doesn't appear on the visual there. So let's just go back to my visual, and I can clear my top N. I could also look at the bottom 5 products, or the bottom 1, or the top 1, and filter accordingly in that way. So one final point on filters is with regards to dates. So again, we'll look at data types in more detail, but let's just start by dragging on my date field here onto my filters on all pages. You'll see that as a start, I've got basic filtering. But when I drop down on my filter type here, I now have this third option of relative date. So let's select that. So what this does, this allows me to select particular dates based on those dates being, in this case, in the last so many days. I could do in this day, month, year, etc., or in the next day, month, year. And so let's say I just wanted only sales that were in the last 90 days. I can apply that, and my visuals have updated. I could equally look at weeks, calendar weeks, months, calendar months, years and calendar years in exactly the same way there. And also when I'm looking at dates, if I drop down on my filter type and go to advanced filtering again, you'll notice that this time again looks slightly different to the advanced filtering for numeric or text fields. This time I have the option to specify is on or after, is before, and I can specify a date and a time within my filter there. Okay, so that's filters. Let's have a look at slicers next. So slicers operate in a very similar way to filters. Let's just make a bit of space on the dashboard here. I'm going to add in a slicer from my visualizations pane. And I'm going to start just by dragging in country again into my field list for this slicer. So you can see that what I've got here is a selection similar to that I had on the filter pane. I can select Canada, the page updates. I can select France, and again the page updates. If I drop down on my select type of slicer here, I can modify to a drop down, and then I could also go to my format tab here, go to my selection controls, and at the moment I've got multi-select with control turned on. I could turn that off, which would now allow me to select multiple values at once. Again, I have the single select option. I have the option to add a select all. So now when I turn that on, if I drop down on here, I have my select all at the top. And there are the usual options that you'd expect around formatting and titles, visual header, etc. For any Power BI visual. So again, this works in a similar way in that once I select a country, as I say, that applies to the visuals on this page, and I can erase them using the clear filter button there. But note that when I apply this filter here, if I select France there, for example, and I go onto my next page, I still have all my countries showing. So by default, this slicer is only affecting the page that it's on. That doesn't have to be the way, so I can copy this slicer, I can paste it onto another page, and then I'm going to go to the View menu at the top here. And you'll notice actually before I do that, that Power BI has actually prompted me to say, do I want to sync these visuals? And I do, and normally I would just click sync to this, but I just want to show you the method of syncing them if you accidentally click don't sync, or if you are creating a new slicer rather than copying and pasting. So let's see what happens there. So I'll click don't sync, and go to View at the top. I'm going to go to Sync Slicers. You'll notice that I've got this extra pane that's appeared here called Sync Slicers. Now, when I select a slicer, I can see whether or not that slicer is visible on each page. So I've got a tick next to product sales because it's visible on product sales, a tick next to page 1 because it's visible on page 1, and then I can select these boxes to say, do I want to sync the slicer on those pages as well. So if I tick these, now you'll notice that when I select, for example, Germany on this page, if I go to my other product sales page, I've just got Germany selected there as well. So that's how I can sync my slicers. And they work in much the same way as the filters pane. So I see a slightly different view. If I copy this slicer here, and instead of a text field, I bring in a numeric field. Let's take off my country field, sorry. Now I have the option to, if I drop down on the arrow here, as well as a list, a drop down, I can do a between, which gives me this slider to specify a range. So I can only show sales between certain values. I can expand out this slicer, drop down and change that to less than or equal to. Gives me a slightly different slider that I can change there. And I get a similar view if I bring in my date field into my slicer here. So let's just drag that on. So I've got to have to remove my units sold from my slicer, so I'm just looking at date. I've got a basic selection there, or I can drop down and I can look at between again with my sliders. Users can either specify a value directly into these boxes, or they can drag the slider again. So quite a nice way of interacting with dates. Or I can drop down and look at relative date again. I could say in the last 1 month. Okay, so that's slicers. But you might be thinking, why do we need a filters pane and slicers? Which is a very good question. And there are several reasons, but I think some of the main reasons are, firstly, that the slicers draw the user's attention to the part of the page that they're filtering and the option that they have for filtering. And so can be quite a nice way of directing them towards that filter and that option. It also allows me to position the filter next to a particular visual if I just want users to be able to filter only that visual. So I could move my date filter, my date slicer here, for example. I can modify my interactions as we looked at in the last tutorial. So I can go onto format here, edit interactions, and I could say that I don't want to have any interactions with any other visual except for my products sold. And what you'll notice then is, if let's just change this back to a list. Now when I specify May, notice that the visual here changes, but none of the other visuals change. And I could draw the user's attention to that, maybe by putting a box or a border around it. Like so. And that, for example, might be a more aesthetic way of drawing a user's attention to that selection than expecting the user to maybe select the visual themselves and use the filters pane. I think the other reason is partly legacy. Um, but there are, as I say, there are definitely justifications to using slices as well as the filters pane, and or instead of, depending on your preference and your user's preference. So that's filters and slices. Thanks again for watching. If you've enjoyed this video, please do like and subscribe. And as always, I'd really welcome any feedback, comments or thoughts or suggestions that you have. Please do add them to the comments underneath this video. And I look forward to speaking to you again.